Right now, scattered across the world's oceans, there are over 200 perfectly preserved 300-year-old time capsules just resting in the dark.
Yeah, it's an incredible visual.
Right. And, we aren't talking about pirate ships or like those romanticized treasure galleons you see in movies. We are talking about the delivery fleet of the world's very first multinational mega corporation.
VOC.
Exactly. Today, we are doing a comprehensive global review of the underwater wreckage left behind by the Verenigde Oostendisch Company. Most of us just know them as the VOC, or, the Dutch East India Company.
Right, the absolute powerhouse of the era.
Yeah, and if you follow global economic history, you know that between 1602 and 1795, they basically invented the concept of the modern corporate monopoly.
They really did. I mean, the scale of their logistics network is, it's still difficult to wrap your head around, even by modern shipping standards.
It's massive.
Over nearly 2 centuries, they operated a fleet of around 4,700 ships. And, this was a private company, but they functioned like a sovereign nation.
Minting their own money, right?
Exactly. They minted their own currency, maintained their own heavily armed standing armies, negotiated international treaties. But operating at the bleeding edge of global maritime limits meant attrition.
Yeah, the ocean always wins, eventually.
Always. Out of those 4,700 vessels, an estimated 247 were lost. They were swallowed by violent storms, ripped apart by uncharted coral reefs, or sunk in geopolitical conflicts.
Which means the VOC accidentally deposited a scattered global network of archaeological sites across the seafloor.
A literal trail of data.
Exactly, a trail of data. And our mission for this deep dive into the source material is to look at these wrecks not just as, piles of rotting wood and rusted cannons, but as incredibly high-resolution data sets.
Yeah, that's the perfect way to look at it.
These ships are physical windows into the mechanics of early global capitalism, the absolute extremes of human endurance, and the highly technical modern battle to preserve this data before it vanishes completely. Okay, let's unpack this.
Right. Because you can't really grasp the geopolitical reach of the VOC without first looking at the sheer volume of material they were moving.
Before these ships even cleared European waters.
Exactly. I mean, the cargo manifests from the outbound journeys are essentially blueprints of early corporate ambition.
Oh, for sure.
A perfect example of this is the Amsterdam. This was a massive, top-of-the-line East Indiaman built in 1748. But its career was incredibly short.
Just one voyage, right?
Barely even one. On its maiden voyage in 1749, it ran into severe westerly gales in the English Channel.
And it was just a cascading disaster from there.
Complete disaster. An epidemic was ravaging the crew, the steering gear failed, and then the rudder just sheared completely off.
Wow.
So the captain, Willem Klump, made the desperate calculation to beach the ship on the muddy shores near Hastings in the UK. Just saved the crew.
Right, so it sinks deep into the beach, and the local population basically strips the upper decks of whatever they can carry off.
As they do.
Right, standard 18th century salvage. And then the hull is swallowed by the mud and forgotten for centuries until 1969.
Ah, yes, the Bill Young story.
It's wild. A project manager named Bill Young is working on a sewage outfall pipe nearby, hears rumors of a wreck, and actually takes a mechanical digger out at low tide to scoop a chunk out of the buried bow.
Which is an archaeologist's absolute worst nightmare.
The literal worst. But it did force the rediscovery of the Amsterdam.
It did. It forced a rescue operation that revealed something unprecedented. Because when systematic archaeological excavations finally began in the 1980s, they found that the mud hadn't just swallowed the ship.
It had isolated it.
Exactly. The Amsterdam sank incredibly fast into this thick, fine silt. It created a completely anaerobic environment.
It's basically historical shrink wrap.
That is exactly what.
It completely starves the wood-eating bacteria and marine borers of the oxygen they need to survive.
That's the exact mechanism. Without oxygen, biological decay basically halts. And because of that anaerobic seal, 2/3 of the entire ship survived intact.
2/3? That's incredible.
It is. We aren't just finding cannons. We're finding thousands of sealed bottles of wine, perfectly intact crates of military supplies, textiles.
And the personal stuff too, right?
Yes. The hyper-personal possessions of the 330 sailors, soldiers, and passengers. Intricately carved bone knife handles, leather shoes, wooden combs.
Unbelievable.
The preservation is so absolute that researchers have actually cross-referenced specific physical objects found in the mud with individual personnel files kept in the corporate archives in the Netherlands.
See, that level of granular data is why there is a massive modern engineering proposal floating around right now called Docking the Amsterdam.
Oh, that project is wildly ambitious.
They don't just want to pull up artifacts, they want to salvage the entire hull.
The engineering required for that is monumental. A coalition led by the Amsterdam city archaeologists proposes building a custom, watertight salvage dock entirely around the wreck site at Hastings.
So they just scoop it up.
They would carefully lift the ship, mud and all, and sail the entire apparatus back to the Netherlands.
That is insane.
The plan is to install it in a facility with transparent underwater viewing galleries. So, the public can watch maritime archaeologists excavate the remaining interior in real time.
I love the audacity of moving a 300-year-old shipwreck across the ocean in its own custom swimming pool.
It's very Dutch.
It really is. But, okay, while the Amsterdam is this pristine snapshot of official corporate logistics, I want to talk about the Rooswijk.
Ah, the Goodwin Sands wreck.
Right. It sank in 1740 off the coast of Kent. And when divers finally got into the cargo hold, they didn't just find the official VOC goods.
No, they found something much more interesting.
They found a staggering amount of hidden illegal silver. And look, I have to question the traditional narrative here. We always hear about the VOC as this ruthless, hyper-regulated monopoly that completely controlled its employees.
That's the textbook version.
Right. So if corporate oversight was so strict, how do a few rogue sailors manage to smuggle millions of silver coins onto heavily guarded company vessels?
Well, what's fascinating here is that the archaeological record exposes the complete failure of that corporate oversight.
Okay, so it was a failure.
Total failure. The VOC demanded a strict monopoly on the currency flowing into the Asian markets. But you have to remember the economic realities of the 18th century. Silver was the primary currency that commanded real purchasing power in Asia.
So everybody wanted in on it.
Every single employee on that ship, from the lowest deckhand to the commanding officers, knew that if they could get European silver into Batavia, they could multiply their personal wealth exponentially on the black market.
So it isn't just a few rogue sailors pulling a side hustle. It's a systemic, industrial-scale shadow economy operating inside the hull of the ship.
Exactly. The smuggling was an economic inevitability. The information asymmetry between the corporate boardroom in Amsterdam and the field agents on the water was just too vast.
And they were hiding it everywhere, right?
Oh, yeah. Employees smuggled these silver coins, known as ducatons, by sewing them into the linings of heavy coats, hollowing out the heels of their shoes and burying them deep in personal sea chests. Economic historians estimate that over the 17th and 18th centuries, VOC personnel illegally smuggled anywhere from 20 to 40 million ducatons.
That is a staggering amount of money.
It is. The Rooswijk wreck is physical proof that the employees were actively subverting the monopoly to build their own parallel wealth.
So if they survived the gales of the English Channel, and they managed to sneak their illicit silver past the corporate inspectors, they eventually have to face the brutal physical reality of getting to Asia.
The hardest part of the journey.
Right, which means taking advantage of the roaring 40s, the incredibly violent prevailing westerly winds in the Southern Ocean. If you've caught those winds from the Cape of Good Hope, you could slingshot your massive heavy ship across the Indian Ocean and shave months off the journey to Indonesia.
The strategy was economically brilliant, but honestly, navigationally terrifying.
Because they couldn't calculate exactly where they were.
Right. To make that turn north toward Batavia, a captain had to calculate their longitude, their exact east-west position on the globe. But reliable marine chronometers hadn't been invented yet.
So this is just guesswork.
They were relying on dead reckoning, estimating speed and direction over thousands of miles of open water.
Which leaves zero room for error.
None. If a captain miscalculated by even a fraction, or if a storm suppressed their ability to take celestial readings, they would overshoot the turn and slam directly into the uncharted, jagged western coast of Australia.
Which sets the stage for the Batavia in 1629.
The most famous of them all.
It is. This is the most infamous VOC wreck in the archives, and it is a masterclass in how quickly social hierarchies collapse in extreme isolation. The ship strikes Morning Reef in the Hultman Abrolhos Islands.
Middle of nowhere.
Literally nowhere. About 40 people drown immediately. The remaining 300 manage to get onto these tiny, sun-blasted coral islands that have zero fresh water.
And then the leadership just abandons them.
Yeah. The commander immediately takes the only viable longboat to get help, leaving a massive power vacuum.
And that vacuum is filled by an undermerchant named Geronimus Cornelis.
He sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Cornelis is a study in sociopathic opportunism. He realizes that there are too many survivors and not enough resources to sustain them until a rescue ship arrives. So he systematically dismantles the social order.
Just takes over completely.
He takes control of the remaining weapons, centralizes the limited food and water supplies, and isolates any potential rivals on neighboring islands under the guise of, searching for water.
He weaponizes the logistics of survival.
Precisely.
Once he controls the water, he commands absolute obedience from a small cadre of mutineers. And over the next few months, they orchestrate the brutal massacre of 125 men, women, and children.
It's horrific. And it proves that the sophisticated corporate structure of the VOC was incredibly fragile.
Yeah, the moment you remove the institutional threats of prison or lost wages, the whole civilization collapses into a bloodbath.
Exactly.
But, it's worth noting that not all the Australian wrecks ended in a Lord of the Flies massacre. Some are purely psychological thrillers, like the Virgule de Drac, or Gilt Dragon from 1656.
Oh, that wreck remains one of maritime archaeology's most haunting open questions.
Because they just vanished.
Completely.
Yeah.
75 people initially survived the wreck and made it to the remote Australian shore. They managed to launch a small boat with 7 sailors to make the grueling run to Batavia for help.
And those 7 actually made it.
They defied the odds and arrived safely. But when the VOC sent rescue expeditions back to those exact coordinates on the Australian coast,
They found an empty beach.
nothing. All 68 remaining survivors had simply vanished into the desert.
And for nearly 4 centuries, that was the end of the story? But recent terrestrial surveys are finally cracking the case.
Yeah, the new findings are amazing.
Over the last couple of years, specifically 2022 and 2024, researchers and metal detectorists found highly specific 17th century artifacts buried in the sand dunes miles from the wreck site. Right, inland. They found a pair of brass navigational dividers, lead spring shot designed for VOC muskets, and heavy brass clothing clasps.
Which doesn't just wash ashore.
Exactly. These anomalies strongly indicate a long-term survivor camp, and a major excavation is slated for 2025. We might actually decode the final days of those 68 people.
It highlights how fluid historical narratives really are. I mean, a site isn't closed just because it's been documented. Sometimes new analytical tools completely exonerate historical figures.
Oh, you mean like the Zootdorp?
Yes. Take the wreck of the Zootdorp, which vanished in 1712 with a massive cargo of silver bullion.
Right.
For generations, the standing assumption was that the navigator was simply incompetent, that he failed to calculate longitude, ignored the signs of the approaching coast, and blindly steered his ship into the cliff.
It's because it's easier to blame human error than admit you were at the mercy of the ocean.
Always. But the modern meteorological and archaeological data paints a much more terrifying picture of that wreck.
But they didn't make a mistake at all, did they?
They really didn't. When researchers cross-referenced contemporary navigational charts, historical weather patterns, and the surviving logs from other ships in the area, the incompetent navigator theory just fell apart.
Wow.
The evidence shows the officers of the Zootdorp knew exactly where they were. They recognized the changing water color, the seaweed patterns, the approaching swell. They initiated all the correct evasive maneuvers to pull away from the coast.
But they got caught on a lee shore during a massive freak weather event.
Exactly. The wind and the swell were pushing them toward the cliffs with more kinetic energy than their sails could overcome to pull away.
So they were just trapped.
The physics were insurmountable. It wasn't a failure of navigation. It was a failure of 18th century maritime technology against the raw atmospheric power of the Indian Ocean. They were violently, helplessly driven ashore.
Okay, so let's follow the successful ships. Let's look at the ones that actually survived the Roaring Forties, make the turn north, and arrive safely in Asia. What is the actual economic mechanism at play here?
Right. What do they do once they arrive?
Exactly. Because the popular assumption is that they sail to a port, load up a bunch of nutmeg and silk, and immediately turned around to sail back to Amsterdam.
Which is completely false.
Right, they didn't. They entrenched themselves into the inter-Asiatic trade web.
The VOC realized very quickly that simply ferrying goods between Europe and Asia was highly inefficient.
The margins just weren't good enough.
No, not at all. The real wealth was generated by participating in the complex, localized trade routes that already connected the Asian continent.
Give me an example of that route.
So they began moving raw silk from Persia to Japan, using the profits to buy Japanese copper, shipping that copper to India to trade for cotton textiles, and then trading those textiles in the Indonesian archipelago for spices.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The ships operating in this localized network weren't always pristine Dutch vessels. Let's look at the Avondster, which sank in Galley Harbor, Sri Lanka in 1659.
One of my favorite examples.
The Avondster wasn't even built by the VOC. It was originally an English ship called the John and Thomas.
Stolen, basically.
Captured. The Dutch captured it during the First Anglo-Dutch War, slapped a new name on the hull, and integrated it into their regional logistics network.
So practical.
And when archaeologists finally excavated it, they found its ballast was entirely composed of Dutch yellow bricks.
The famous yellow bricks.
Yeah, these were bricks used as dead weight in the hull that the VOC would constantly offload and recycle to build their sprawling colonial forts along the Asian coast.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, a captured English ship carrying Dutch bricks to build forts in Sri Lanka is a physical manifestation of a crucial economic shift.
Historians call it the Great Divergence.
Yes, the VOC is often credited with globalizing the Indian Ocean, but that's a fundamentally flawed Eurocentric view. The Indian Ocean was already deeply globalized.
Right, but who was actually running that machinery before the Europeans showed up with naval artillery? Because the infrastructure had to be incredibly sophisticated to move that much localized cargo.
Oh, it was. The infrastructure had been refined for millennia.
Really? That long?
Absolutely. The trade of Indonesian spices, Arabian horses, and Indian textiles was managed by deeply collaborative Bharatiya merchants.
And they had their own protection, right?
Yes, they were protected and facilitated by naval powers like the Chola and Pandyan dynasties. This was a sophisticated ecosystem built largely on localized trust, complex credit systems, and mutual economic benefit across the entire region.
So how does a single corporation from a cold swamp in northern Europe dismantle a millennia-old economic ecosystem? They don't do it by offering better textiles or a more efficient trade route.
Definitely not.
They do it by weaponizing capital.
Exactly. The Great Divergence wasn't a triumph of better market economics. It was a triumph of applied violence.
Which is a stark way to put it, but it's true.
It is. The VOC introduced a heavily militarized form of monopoly capitalism. They used their massive capital reserves to build those brick forts, enforce exclusive coercive contracts on local rulers, and use naval artillery to physically destroy the shipping of the collaborative Bharatiya networks.
It was a takeover.
A violent one. The shipwrecks we are mapping today aren't just remnants of trade. They are the ballistic residue of an aggressive corporate takeover of the global economy.
And the incredible wealth that fueled that violence 3 centuries ago is exactly what makes these shipwrecks targets for a very different kind of violence today.
The modern looting problem.
Now, we have to look at the modern tensions surrounding these sites, because finding a VOC wreck isn't just an archaeological discovery. It's the discovery of a multi-million-dollar asset.
Which attracts the wrong kind of attention.
Exactly. And for decades, the standard operating procedure was basically underwater strip mining.
The tension is fundamentally between salvage and science.
Right.
Are these wrecks exploitable commodities to be liquidated, or are they fragile data sets of cultural heritage? The watershed moment for this conflict was the Geldermalsen.
1752, South China Sea.
Yes. In 1985, a commercial salver named Michael Hatcher located the wreck, but his methodology wasn't archaeological. It was purely extractive.
He didn't care about the history.
Not at all. He essentially used commercial salvage equipment to vacuum the site.
And he pulled up an insane amount of stuff.
Roughly 160,000 pieces of pristine Chinese export porcelain.
And 126 solid gold ingots.
Exactly. He completely bypassed the academic community, shipped the entire haul to Amsterdam, and auctioned it off for over 10 million pounds.
So financially, a huge win for him.
Financially, a massive success. Archaeologically, it was catastrophic.
Because he destroyed the context.
Completely. The problem with commercial salvage is the complete destruction of context. In a shipwreck, The stratigraphy, the exact physical position of an artifact relative to the hull and other objects, tells us how the cargo was packaged, the daily routines of the crew, the specific engineering of the holds.
Like the data we talked about earlier.
Exactly. When Hatcher ripped the gold and porcelain out of the seabed without meticulously recording its spatial position, he permanently erased the historical data. We have the teacups, but we lost the knowledge of the ship.
But the Geldermalsen disaster did trigger a severe backlash in the academic community, and the methodology had to evolve.
It was a wake-up call.
A great example of this shift is the Oosterland, which wrecked in Table Bay, South Africa in 1697. When it was rediscovered in the late 1980s, the local divers didn't quietly liquidate the cargo.
They partnered with the University of Cape Town.
Right. To execute the first systematic maritime excavation in southern Africa.
They approached the site like a crime scene rather than a treasure chest.
Which is how it should be done.
Absolutely. They brought in an interdisciplinary team of geoscientists, sediment chemists, and oceanographers. Before a single artifact was moved, they meticulously mapped the three-dimensional spatial relationships of the wreckage in a highly volatile underwater environment.
It proved that scientific rigor was possible, even in challenging maritime conditions.
It really set a new standard.
But there is a deeply pragmatic, almost absurd irony to the situation in South Africa today.
Oh, the Modern Oral History Project.
Yeah. From the 1960s straight through to the 1990s, commercial treasure hunters completely shredded the context of dozens of other coastal VOC wrecks. They dynamited hulls and dredged the reefs.
Just absolute destruction.
The artifacts are gone, dispersed into private collections, so modern heritage agencies are now running this project where they are scrambling to interview those aging commercial looters before they pass away.
It sounds counterintuitive, right? To collaborate with the people who destroyed the sites.
It feels wrong, but it makes sense.
It's a necessary triage. Those looters hold private journals, hand-drawn maps, and memories that represent the only surviving contextual data of those destroyed wrecks. You have to capture the data where it exists, even if the source is compromised.
Fortunately, the tools to protect untouched sites have advanced significantly. In 2001, UNESCO ratified the Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage.
Which is huge for the field.
It establishes the international legal standard that wrecks should be preserved in situ left untouched on the seabed whenever possible. But how do you enforce that when deep water remote-operated vehicles, or ROVs, make it incredibly easy for black market salvors to access wrecks that used to be protected simply by the crushing pressure of the deep ocean?
Well, the defense strategies have become highly technical. Archaeologists are fighting back with advanced 3D photogrammetry.
Like digital mapping.
Exactly. Using automated submersibles, they take thousands of high-resolution images of a wreck, like the Rooswijk, down to the millimeter. They stitch these together into perfect digital twins hosted on platforms like the Maritime Stepping Stones or MASS database.
So you don't even have to dive to study it.
Right. It allows global researchers to study the context of a wreck without ever physically disturbing the site.
And for the physical artifacts themselves, they're using forensic marking. If they find a bronze VOC cannon on the seafloor that is at high risk of being stolen, they can't always afford to raise it. So they deploy divers to essentially tag the metal with advanced forensic liquids.
Exactly. These liquids contain unique, synthetic chemical isotopes or microdots that penetrate the microscopic pores of the metal.
And they don't wash off.
No, they are engineered to survive extreme saltwater corrosion. If a black market salver steals that cannon and tries to launder it through a legitimate auction house years later, customs authorities can scan the metal under specific wavelengths.
They detect the chemical signature.
Yes, and prove definitively which wreck it was looted from and seize it.
That is brilliant. So what does this all mean? We've traced the mechanics of anaerobic preservation in the mud of the English Channel, analyzed the grim psychology of mutiny on the coral reefs of Australia, explored the weaponization of capital in the Sri Lankan trade hubs, and detailed the forensic tracking of stolen bronze today.
It's a lot of ground to cover.
It is. But these scattered debris fields aren't just isolated tragedies. They are the sunken scaffolding of the modern, interconnected global economy.
And as our deep-sea technology rapidly accelerates, this raises an important question about jurisdiction and intent. We have the tools to reach any wreck on the planet. Now we have to figure out what they represent.
Exactly.
Are they simply dormant financial assets waiting for the highest bidder, or are they a shared global archive of human history that requires collective protection?
It is a heavy quotient, and it leaves us with one final, incredibly complicated thought to consider today.
What's that?
Well, under current international maritime law, the modern Dutch state is recognized as the legal successor to the VOC, which means the Netherlands maintains the legal right of ownership over these sunken ships, regardless of where they sit on the globe.
Even in foreign waters.
Right. That includes wrecks currently decaying in the territorial waters of former colonies, the very countries whose indigenous trade networks the VOC actively and violently dismantled to build its monopoly.
That is a tough moral knot to untangle.
It really is. Does the legal right to a shipwreck always align with the moral right to its heritage? Whose history is it, really? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it inspired you to look a little closer at the mechanics of our past and to keep questioning the history resting quietly beneath the waves.